Well, good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. My name is Gavin Nichols and I'm an Executive Director with Veitch Lister Consulting. Today I'm joining you from the absolutely stunning Mareeba Shire here in far north Queensland. I will be your host for today's knowledge sharing session and making sure to keep my colleagues on time and on task. Thank you for joining us. Our session today got me thinking about my own personal data footprint on my trip from my home base in Brisbane to far north Queensland. Notwithstanding purchases on my credit card for accommodation, flights, rental car and other bits and pieces, my trip to the airport would have been tracked via CCTV and tolling points, which would have recorded a car registered to me using the same credit card to pay for those tolls. My mobile device in my pocket only added to my data footprint. The signal from my phone and GPS data from any apps I used along the way, tracking my every move from the time I left home until the time I arrived at my destination. If we were able to combine all of those pieces of data together, you would quickly get a sense of who I am and what my preferences are. And perhaps you could plan an ideal world for me. Our presenters today, Ali Inayat Hussain and Nick Veitch, will guide you through some of the strengths and weaknesses of different types of data from telecommunications companies, or telcos as they are often referred, location-based services, or LBS, and other technologies. Our aim is to also give you some tips and insights to help you select the most relevant data set for your needs. There is no doubt that big data has enhanced our ability to analyse problems and make informed decisions in a vast number of areas across society. One area we can now understand more comprehensively is how people move around and use our cities. There are many claims made about the value of big data and its application to planning, and today we want to give you some independent insight to help you on your way. With many millions of data points now available from many different sources, it can be a nightmare to know where to start. The important thing is that the questions we ask of the data shouldn't necessarily change just because we now have the data. If you have any questions during today's presentations, please type them into the chat box, and if we have time, we'll attempt to answer those at the conclusion of the presentations. I would like to now introduce our speakers for today. First, you will hear from VLC's Managing Director, Nick Veitch. Nick will present an overview of the types of geospatial data that enables planners to understand how people move around our cities and regions. Following Nick, VLC's National Director of Future Transport, Ali Inayat Hussain, will dive deeper into the veracity of location-based services data and highlight some unique use cases. Over to you, Nick.
Thank you very much, Gavin. So yes, coming from sunny Melbourne today. So let's get started. So what we're hoping to with this knowledge sharing seminar today, what we're hoping to talk about is give you a little bit more context of data, and particularly different types of spatial big data that you could be using in your local government projects. We'll go through the strengths and weaknesses of some of the different data sets we've certainly come across in our time of working with local governments. And as Gav pointed out, Ali's going to go into a location-based services deep dive, mainly because it's a data set that, as we've been talking to local governments, a lot of people there's not been a deep awareness of that data set, and we think that it's got significant value for a whole wide range of areas of local government planning. So Ali will talk a little bit more in depth about that, and I hope there are a number of questions that come through on that. So, and most importantly, we do hope you learn something from today. We will be recording the webinar, so you'll be able to also look back if you missed anything as we go along. So there's a wide range of data needs for local governments. It's really important, certainly when you're planning for the future of your particular jurisdiction or region. It's really important to understand how the community, how the people that live within your area, work within your area, interact with the built form. And there's a range of data sets, and we'll put a lot of focus on that today. We'll also, in providing amenities and facilities, so that's looking at things like the utilisation of parks, community centres, car parks and more. There are a wide range of data sets that you could use. Advocacy on behalf of local residents, so understanding which residents are likely to be impacted by particularly new projects. and to understand also how they are behaving in their area and moving around your jurisdiction, and also planning for travel disruptions and events. So there's a wide range of data sets that you can get to understand who might be impacted by a disruption. It could be a transport disruption, could be an event where you might be putting in some closures. There are a wide range of data sets which we'll talk to today. So data is everywhere. Gavin gave us a little bit of an insight there as to what his data footprint would be. But what's really hard as practitioners, it's hard to get the insight out of the data, because the data might not necessarily be readily accessible to you as a practitioner. It can be extremely costly, particularly for local governments. Budgets are a concern. And so actually getting access to that data can be a financial problem, just as much as getting your hands on the data is a problem. And there is also hidden weaknesses, and we're hopefully scratching the surface a little bit today on those hidden weaknesses, so that for your benefit, when you do come to your projects, you're aware of some of the strengths and weaknesses of various data sets. So Gavin, obviously up in far north Queensland, he talked about CCTV, but as he was going about his day, he would have also been using his smartphone, and his smartphone would have been leaving a digital footprint. If you're in many of our cities, have or public transport sensors and smart cards. So obviously there's a picture there of Mikey, and that you're leaving a digital footprint that way using your credit card. CCTV is obviously widely used these days, as is Bluetooth and Wi-Fi devices. You'll see when you're going about driving on a lot of our streets, we see tubes on roads that are also counting traffic. So and lastly, the telecommunications companies. So there we've got it on the far right, a picture of a cell tower that, as we all carry around our smartphones, we're leaving a digital footprint, and that data is extremely valuable and is being used by a number of the telecommunications companies to unlock insight and help with planning. So when we talk about mobile phone data, it can mean different things to different people. And I want to make this point mainly because it'll help you understand a little bit more about the types of data we talk about. So on the left-hand side, we talk about telco data. And when we talk about telcos, we're talking about the likes of Telstra, Optus, Vodafone, your network providers, and the data that they obtain are sourced from the interaction between your cell device and the cell towers. So cell towers, they vary in terms of their spatial coverage, but the data that they collect comes from the cell towers. They do supplement it with some GPS-based data that they can collect as well. So what the sort of information that the cell providers have are things like location, on time, and also on limited demographics. Now, they do have large sample sizes. As you can imagine, the likes of Telstra have over 40% sample of all cell devices in Australia. So the sample size of data that they are collecting is extremely large. But yeah, just to be clear, on the left, it is the way they collect data is through pings from cell towers. On the right is another form of mobile phone data, and that is collected from the cell device itself. So what this is when you use an app, your app, when you accept to be able to allow location to be tracked, you can also, that data is collected by the app providers, and in some cases made available by license to a number of organizations, and that data can be used for planning. Now, it gives you so it's using the GPS sensors from your phone. The quality is very mixed, and it will depend on the apps that are used and also the device that's used. And the sample's restricted by the number of app users. So obviously, depending on the apps that are provided in your LBS or location-based services sample will determine the likely biases, the likely strengths of the data that you've got. And also things like the temporal coverage of pings. So every time that your device actually leaves what would be a latitude, longitude, or a ping of where you are located at a particular timestamp, that will vary depending on the apps as well. So looking at the telco side, the data is collected and sold by network providers, so that we would collectively know those as telcos, and that includes movement information for most of their users. When I say most, the reason why I've highlighted that is that for the likes of business customers, they cannot obviously use business customers' movement information, but they can for all the retail, the mums and dads who take their cell devices around there as part of, I guess, signing up with those particular telco providers. You are also enabling them to be able to collect and sell the data that you're providing them by just simply moving around the built form. It does use the location, as I mentioned, from cell towers, and you can see on the right that gives a little bit of an example as to how they would be able to actually triangulate where you might be located depending on the strength of the signal of each cell tower. So in terms of how well they can isolate your actual location will be purely dependent on the number of cell towers in an area. So in areas like CBDs, where they'll have more cell towers to deal with the large numbers of people that congregate in CBDs, they'll be able to pinpoint you probably a little bit more accurately. In further suburban areas, less so, where there's less cell towers to be able to actually triangulate your movements and where you are. Now, the data that they collect from this can be used for a number of local government projects, things like getting origin destination matrices, so understanding where do people travel from and to. And increasingly, we're also seeing the telcos use a lot of this data for things like precinct and events analysis. So understanding quite a deep dive as far as visitations to precincts, to events, looking at temporal profiles, so how many visitors did you have to that area over a course of, and this can be at quite granular temporal levels, so it could be by hour, and also quite decent demographic breakdowns as well, because they're getting such large sample sizes. They can the granularity of the data is quite detailed. The main point is to talk about sample size. Now, in terms of understanding the full movements of people as they travel around our cities, the sample size of telco data is extremely large. 40% is for Telstra data is very representative of all trips, and the sample size is very strong with telco data. And we're seeing that certainly at the state government level, a lot of use of the telco data. These are some examples that all you need to do is look at DSpark and Redify's websites. So DSpark is a company owned by Singtel, so obviously through Optus, and they collect Optus data and be able to use it for insights. So if you look at here, they're looking at visitations, looking at total visitors year-on-year comparison to Blue Mountains. So this was obviously looking at the fires there, the bushfires, and how certainly the tourists and the numbers of visitors to the Blue Mountains significantly decreased year-on-year from when we had the bushfires through to comparing it to the year before. So that just gives you an interesting use case of the telco data, as does the right-hand side, which would look at crowd volumes. And this is through using Telstra Location Insights, which is now sold through Redify, I believe a Telstra subsidiary. And yeah, they are able to give you significant levels of data on events, and looking at things like how did the crowds change over time, what were the demographics of the people in those areas. Now, they can be used for events, but it can also be looked at more aggregate levels of information, and understanding OD movements is a big strength of the telco data. Now, talking about the other form of mobile phone data is the location-based services. Location events are collected through apps from smartphones, so there is bias in it. Not everyone has smartphones or wide users of apps, but the data is rich, and the location data in particular is more accurate than what you would get from a telco data set, whereas it's not using triangulation, it's using the GPS from your phone, which gives you accuracy to within 5 to 10 meters in terms of spatial accuracy. So there's a lot more applications we feel you can use this data for. Now, there's data aggregators. These are global firms that combine data from thousands of apps. So they do get permission from the users to be able to collect their location, and sample size for this data is actually increased through aggregation of multiple apps. So those are a lot of the data aggregators will have a commercial agreement with all the app providers, and they're trying to increase those sample size all the time. Now, the data can be analysed to extract significant insights, and we'll talk a little. Ali will go really deep and give you some use cases for local government on the use cases for LBS data. But the location events, because you have latitude and longitude and the spatial accuracy is quite high, you can use the data to understand a lot of things around dwell times, how long do people spend in an area, around trip-making behaviours, really end-to-end journeys, so understanding routing through your network, whether it's from a pedestrian or even from a vehicular point of view. There's a lot of data that you can get and insights you can get from this data. Now, some of the use cases that Ali will deep dive into a lot more, but some of the use cases that I'll just point you towards are really around the Google Community Mobility Report, which has been using so you can see the impact of COVID across a wide range of areas. The screenshot there looks at New South Wales and compares to baseline across a whole wide range of things, from retail and recreation to parks. The URL is down the bottom if you'd like to see any more of those, or just Google the Google Community Mobility Reports. And so those have got a wide media coverage, and also what we've done is using LBS is look at COVID impacts through a mobility trends dashboard. So you can just go to the veachlister.com.au website, go to thoughts and actually find our dashboard through there, and you'll be able to see how I guess visitations to things like CBDs, to airports, to shopping centres, to public transport. At this point, we've done the 3 major cities, but we could be doing that. We've got Australia-wide data here that could be used to provide insights on how visitations to areas have been impacted as a result of a disruption like the current pandemic. What we've seen from the data is that shopping centre visitations, particularly in the 3 major cities, have significantly recovered in the last couple of weeks. Suburban shopping centres were a little bit, they were always a little bit ahead, of major shopping centres. Major shopping centres are now starting to recover a little bit, I think, to around about 80% of normal conditions on weekends. But certainly CBDs and rail are hit massively still, as are airports, which have just flatlined. We're still seeing around 10 to 15% of visitations to airports. So do check this out. This is just a use case of LBS data. It can also provide significant heat maps. Just keeping with the code theme, on the left, what you can see is the locations. So that's a heat map of the 3rd of March this year. And you can see that obviously as a congregation around the CBDs and employment clusters near the central business district, that's where you're getting the high number of visitors. On the right-hand side, you can see that the numbers are actually much more dispersed. There are a lot less people in the CBDs, a lot more people working from homes, and that's clear when we start to see a much more dispersed visitation heat map, as we would expect. The last one we'll touch on just at a high level is really sensor-based technologies, and we're seeing, particularly through the smart cities initiatives funded by the federal government, a lot of local governments are starting to put their own sensors down in their networks, and this is really to understand volumes, how many people are in an area at any given time. They can also be used to understand things like travel speeds. So because of the fact that you can get the MAC address, you can get a unique identifier between devices. You can actually understand this particular device, how long did it take to get between 2 particular sensors that you might have in your network. And so the data is very valuable, mainly for those 2 use cases of volumes and for speeds, that say how fast people are moving between the network. And I guess the solutions for large areas, they can be costly depending on whether you're implementing your own, and therefore there's obviously the cost of deploying it and maintaining the physical infrastructure. But there are options where you can deploy it for a shorter period of time, particularly for a project for a week, to be able to collect this data. But yeah, depending on the way you go, the costs can be quite varied. But the data is rich, but it's rich for that particular area that you put it in. So you'll get a significant amount of value of the data where you put those devices, but outside of that, you're not able to get an insight on where did those people come from, where do they live, where are they going to, and that's sort of where we see the value of the LBS data. So some of the examples around Australia you might not be aware of. One I'll point to, in a bit of a shout out to our friends at Department of Planning, Transport and Infrastructure in South Australia, the AdInsight platform, which is a software platform owned and maintained by DIPTI, the department. And you'll see on the left-hand side, what that is the number of Bluetooth devices that are down in each of these cities that are connected into their software platform. And what the AdInsight platform does is it actually can provide traffic operators, so these are the likes of Main Roads WA, the likes of Vic Roads, to be able to understand travel movements and speeds across your network. It also can capture things like origin destination movements, because they're able to use the MAC address, use unique identifiers to actually track people's movements through the network. And you can see there on the right hand side how many Bluetooth devices they've got down in Adelaide. I think there's over 1,000 in Adelaide. I know Melbourne have certainly been investing significantly in them, and I believe on most of our state capitals have these devices. In New South Wales, they'll be plugging it into the AdInsight platform as well soon enough. So this is sort of a practical, very strategic implementation of Bluetooth sensors. But the same could be said for a lot of the smart cities initiatives, where a lot of local governments have been putting down their own Bluetooth, their own Wi-Fi detectors to be able to detect how people are moving around, how many people are in a given area, a particular park, a particular activity centre, and that's where those data sets really come to the fore. So just sort of comparing between the three sample sizes on the telco data, large, as I mentioned earlier. The LBS data, one of the common questions we get is around sample size, and it will really vary between 1% on any given day to, as you aggregate across multiple days, you can get up to 5, if not up to 10% sample size. And sensor technologies, it really depends. It depends on the technology that you use. Bluetooth are renowned for capturing, because not everyone has Bluetooth on at the moment. They probably do more often than not, because of the COVID Safe app, that they will, but typically you're looking at 10 to 15% of your sample of people that go past a particular sensor. A Bluetooth sensor will be captured in those sort of sensor technologies. In terms of timeliness, the telco data is near real time. If standard outputs are required, LBS, we have data up until the last 3 days, because there is a time to be able to process, because this is big data. This is terabytes of data that are coming through each day, because it's got every ping from all the cell devices from your sample. So there's a huge amount of data to process each time. And sensor technologies are real time. There's smart cities technologies putting in that can give you real-time parking, real-time understanding of movements within the built environment. Demographic information is varied. Telcos have a little bit more than others. We can infer demographics with LBS. With sensor technologies, there's no immediate way of being able to get demographic information of the people that are within the area. In terms of spatial precision, LBS and sensors have they've got a bigger strength in this respect. LBS obviously using GPS from your phone. Sensor technologies, it's really about having the proximity to the actual sensor, so the accuracy is very high. With telcos, they're increasingly starting to use LBS data to supplement their their telco data, the data coming from cell towers, and so they're starting to improve the spatial detail of their particular data sets, but typically it hasn't been as strong as others. In terms of longitudinal, so both telco and LBS are around about I think about 3 years of data that we can get for both data sets. On the LBS front, it can be a little bit irregular and prone to churn. Just worth bearing in mind that what we mean by churn is that because it's relying on people's apps, you can get people that subscribe and use an app at a given time, but then won't use it for months, and they might start to use it again. And so while we get a high number of unique devices and unique people that come up in the data set, you're not going to get generally a high sample that is used for a significant period of time. Now, just on the travel volume space, I'll just talk about that both telco and LBS, there's significant, you can use it to infer some level of travel volume, but it's imperfect. You definitely need to do work behind the scenes to be able to get an idea of volumes with sensors. That's the primary strength of sensor technologies, is really around the travel volume space. But what we're hoping to today is really, and I'll hand over to Ali now, is really give you a little bit more of a deep dive into LBS, because we believe it kind of fits a really good position between the two data sets of telco and sensors. And he'll go through a couple of the use cases that we've been doing around the traps. So over to you, Ali.
Great, thanks, Nick. So yeah, as Nick said, we will. So what I'll do is I'll talk in a bit more detail about LBS data, and specifically the data that we license and have access to. So the learnings from this can be applied to other data sets as well, but it's worth bearing in mind that there will be variation in the level of usefulness of different data sets depending on where that data is sought from. So as Nick's explained what the LBS data is, but just to kind of summarize and add a bit more really there as well, is just say that you get fairly precise geolocation data from that are collected through mobile phone apps. So you get timestamps, locations, and you get a device ID. It's worth saying that none of the data we receive contains personal information. It's depersonalized. However, the device ID that's persistent there, but can be also the user can reset that. But what that means is that there is the potential to identify people if the data is not treated carefully. So I'll come on to the data privacy side in a second. As Nick mentioned, we can look back 3 years. In terms of sample size, well, with these data sets, you commonly hear numbers that sound very high. So, for example, one way of looking at the data is we have 3 million monthly active users, so that are captured through the data. However, because the data is not of a uniform quality, what you might get is, and what you do in fact get, is that a large proportion of the users you only have a very, very few location points, and therefore it's difficult to do detailed analysis with. And we get around, and that number's higher now, but it's about 6 months ago. We got around 186,000, a sample of 186,000 a day, which had devices which we had a large number of location points for. There are potential biases to be aware of, and the usual ones about kind of ownership of smartphones, but also thinking about the usage of apps. And one of the things that's not disclosed to us is which apps the data come from, and therefore it's some of the biases are difficult to correct for, and so you need to be aware of that when you're dealing with it. And finally, on data privacy, as we say, although it doesn't contain any personal information, it's important that no individuals are identified or re-identified, essentially. And so the steps that are in place to stop that happening is, first of all, there's terms and conditions we sign up to the suppliers which prohibit us doing that. And the way that we then implement those our end is that we make sure that all of the agreements we have with suppliers, with our supplier, that they ensure that the appropriate permissions are sought from the end users to carry out data analysis. All the data is accessed in a secure, controlled environment with named staff members who have undergone training accessing the data. And any data that comes out of the platform is, first of all, monitored, but also is aggregated and anonymized at that stage. So no data is shared, which has the potential for re-identification to take place. So kind of getting into just a bit more on the data overview, I guess the point is it's a lot of data and it covers the whole of Australia. And to give you an idea, there's an average of 500,000 unique users a day. And the point Nick made about churn is quite relevant as well, because you can also reset the unique ID as a user. If any apps are using these identifications, it means that you can get a large number of devices, which may not, unique device may not necessarily reflect a unique person. So that's something to bear in mind with this kind of data. And so it's about always asking for metrics, which not just ask simply for sample size, but also looking at how much churn there is and how many location points are received in a typical day, month, so on for devices. So if we look at so again, this is scratching at the surface. I wanted to get onto use cases, but some of the kind of things that we do to look at data validation is, and a lot of what you'll see today is focusing on the Victorian context. We've kept it consistent there, but just to say these things apply equally to across the country, really. So what you said, and in New Zealand as well, actually. And so what you see here is a comparison between our mobile phone app data and the household travel survey that's carried out in Victoria. And there's a regression plot on the top right, and the key takeaway there really is that overall there's a good match between the data sets in terms of looking, if you looked at an SA3, so statistical area boundaries, quite large, looking at the proportion of trips seen in each SA3 zone. If you compare the household travel survey to the location-based services, you see generally a good match, but you do see outliers. Now, there's some patterns you can spot with the outliers. The one in the top right in the chart, so that's over here. That one is the CBD, and so what that tells us, in line with also we see similar things at the airport, and we see an underrepresentation of some regional centres. We believe that's correlated to the CBDs having higher app usage, first of all, because of higher public transport usage, but also just generally higher smartphone usage. So again, that's something to bear in mind and think about whether that impacts the particular use case. But if you can look at the chart at the bottom, where there's blue spikes and no orange spikes, those are all areas where the mobile app data contains data, but the household travel survey doesn't. So you can see that the power of it is that the larger sample means that it's got wider coverage. Other things we've done as spot checks on data validation, I won't go into too much detail, but is, for example, looking at attendance at the Melbourne Cricket Grounds, at Stadium. And what you see there is that what we've done there is highlighted AFL games, matches that have taken place. And you can see in orange the LBS detected movements and that all the events are detected. And then we've also plotted, indexed the attendance. And you generally see a good match between the two, both in terms of relativities between the size of events and in kind of detailed profiles. We've also compared to a large shopping centre here in Melbourne, again, Chadstone Shopping Centre. We've looked there at taking the Google Popular Times data, so that and just comparing that to our own data. So on the left-hand side, where you've got the Monday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday profiles, time profiles from the Google data, this is also taking it from, comparing it to the LBS data, and that just gives us confidence that the data set is at least telling a similar story to that data. So with that in mind, I mean, the LBS data, it can answer a wide range of questions. These, in the context of local government, vary from, if you're interested in a particular activity center, where do visitors come from, who uses particular roads or other infrastructure. You can look at how car parks are utilized at different times of day, where car park users are coming from, where they're going afterwards. You can understand what visitor travel to the specific local area, the impact of disruptions, whether that be on public transport or on the road network. I mean, it's worth saying that with LBS, it's longer term closures. Very short closures are difficult with the kind of sample size you typically have from this data set. And also you can look at just generally how busy different times of day are. So let's dive into an example. So what we've chosen as a bit of a case study is the Box Hill Metropolitan Activity Centre. So for those of you that don't know it, it's in the east. It's an eastern suburb of Melbourne, and it's kind of not a far out suburb, but it's also not an inner suburb or a CBD type location either. It's somewhere kind of in between. Box Hill has a population of 11,400, and the LGA that it falls within has 162,000 population. You can see that on the chart there, the pie chart on the in the graphic. This is just looking at census journey to work data, and you can see there that the mode share public transport is around 14%, 15%, and essentially this is a metropolitan area activity centre as identified by the Melbourne 2030 strategy, and that aims to make it a high density pedestrian friendly urban centre, or kind of progress even more so down that road. So that's just a bit of context about the area. So what can the LBS data help us understand? So this is looking at heat maps of activity. So these are taking location events from the devices that are seen, and also making sure they're weighted by the devices, because one of the issues you get with this data is some devices will give you lots of location points, others very few, so you need to adjust for things like that. And what you see is there's a few locations that are marked out. Where it's marked Box Hill Central right here, that area that you see there is where there's a station and a shopping centre. And then there's some further education institutions, TAFEs, that are kind of highlighted, and the Box Hill Hospital. And in the weekday morning peak, you see quite a focus in that station area, and that's people going to commuting. And the other areas you see highlighted are kind of employment related. And then if you look at the afternoon, you see more activity at Whitehorse Towers. That's a mixed-use tower containing a lot of residential and also some shopping, cafes, that kind of thing as well. And you also, so that's one of the main standouts there. And you also see the hospital, for example, become more busy. And also you see kind of more widespread movement than you do in the morning. Then if you look at the weekend, that's interesting. You see the retail precinct, which stretches around this whole area, essentially, showing up a lot more as a focus on weekends. And you also see the Coles, so that's this bit that's labelled, coming out more strongly. So that tells you about the kind of power of just understanding the kind of way the space is used for setting the background or context when we're doing kind of strategic work, looking at strategies for a local area. So looking further, what else can we learn? Well, you can also look at, if you start looking at the trip making side, so you can, from the data, you can infer trip making by looking at stops, dwells, and I won't go into technical details, but you can turn it into kind of trips that are made. So what this kind of heat map shows is travel to that orange zone, which is the Metropolitan Activity Centre. Where are people coming from? And you see that 15% of trips come from Box Hill. That's the dark red shaded area. And overall, if you looked at the Whitehorse LGA, 33% come from that LGA. And then the other side of this is also looking, if you look at the chart, that just shows the unique devices seen within the activity center throughout the day on weekdays and weekends. And it's indexed so that it's indexed so that you can kind of compare consistently between them. And what you see there is that for every hour of the day, the weekdays have more unique devices seen than the weekends, which is interesting. So that's another form of analysis that you can do there. Another way of showing the trip data is this kind of data. The only point really, so what's done here is that these lines each represent trips that have taken place. The colors there represent trips that are from different LGAs. And the only point I wanted to make with this visualization is that you can see that fairly small metropolitan activity center still draws travel from a very wide area and from a high number of LGAs. So there's some benefit to not just understanding the key movements, but also the tails of those distributions. And so that's one of the things that this data can be good for. And then there's also focusing on dwell times. So all of these charts show the median dwell time is the main lines that you see, and then the range that's presented there is the upper and lower quartiles. So that's the lower quartiles where 25% of users are at that level, and then the 75% level is at the top. And this is the number of minutes that they're seen in different places. So the charts at the top left is TAFEs, and then you've got Box Hill Central, which is that station and shopping area that I spoke about earlier, and then at the bottom is the Metropolitan Activity Centre as a whole. Now this is interesting because the TAFEs you can see there the range in times that are spent there. So the median is about 6 hours, which is at 7 in the morning, and kind of that's representing people that are coming early and going there for a full day's study. And then you can see that the median drops throughout the day, which makes sense. And it picks up a bit again in the evening. And this is, again, in line with like evening courses and where people are staying a bit longer. Now, looking at Box Hill Central, that's really interesting. What you're seeing there is the data is skewed, especially the upper quartile in the 8 o'clock hour. What is this? Well, this is commuters coming in who are spending the whole day there working. And so that's where you see that 8 o'clock, and that's skewing that. And in the Metropolitan Activity Centre as a whole, you see that effect from 7 to 9. Now, if you take out those really high outliers, then you get a different picture, and you can see that the medians and the upper quartiles are kind of much lower. And what you see is that in Box Hill Central, for example, you've got 20 minutes is the kind of median time through the midday, and it grows as you get to the middle of the day and then comes back down. And then for the Metropolitan Activity Centre as a whole, you see a similar thing that as well. So this dwell time type analysis is interesting because this can be applied to different places and can really help you understand things like the placemaking function of different areas. And it would also be interesting to see if there's been a complete change to a local area. If you compared this from one year to the next, what would you see? So that's the kind of benefit there. So moving away from Box Hill, so that gives you an idea of that kind of use case. You can look further at a whole range of different use cases, which I'll focus in less detail on, but we'll go through. And what you see here is that this is an example with disruption impacts and looking at the roadside. So this is a major freeway going into Melbourne, and what you see here is analysis of an off-ramp, a specific off-ramp off the M80, and where travel is going to that uses that. And the advantage of being able to do this is to understand that if there was a disruption, what kind of areas would be impacted. And another way of kind of looking at disruptions and is also through picking specific sections of roadway, or it can be public transport corridors, understanding where people come from and go to. So what this is plotting is for the Eastern Freeway in Melbourne on the left-hand side, the origins and destinations associated with usage of that piece of road. And on the right-hand side, what you've got is people that use the two sections of specific roads. So the Eastern Freeway that you've got there, and the CityLink corridor that you also see in the middle. So these are the origins and destinations associated with use of both of these corridors. And this kind of analysis can help from a local council perspective to understand the impact of disruptions to specific parts of the network and see what impact it would have on local residents. It could also be used to understand things like the extent of rat running behavior, for example, and help to inform more local policies such as those as well. And this can obviously be done for public transport as well. So you could look at, this is also from a monitoring perspective as well. So if you want to know what happened in a previous event, it must be said that this has to be done with kind of longer term closures. Otherwise, sample size can get quite low. But what this is showing is when you, again, for Melbourne, if you shut up a specific part of the rail line, which is highlighted in that red circle, let's look at those same devices. What happens to those people's movements on days when the line is closed? And at the bottom, you see a heat map of those movements, and you see that it's much more kind of muddled, where people are doing different things rather than just taking the train, as in the top image. And if you look at that in more detail, you can start to understand detailed behavior around, are they switching to rail replacement buses? Are they switching to car bus? Are they switching to alternative rail lines? So this is all the kind of analysis that can be done there. Another use case is car park analysis, so parking analysis. So in this example, what we've looked at is Preston, a station, a particular rail station. The orange in the left-hand image highlights the car park areas that were analyzed. And then in the middle, you see a heat map of, well, people who go to that car park, where are they going next? And it's interesting to see that you see a hotspot on the kind of rail usage. So the this is all like the platform and rail usage. And you also, however, do see people going to the nearby kind of shopping area and high street, which is interesting to observe. And in this case, that's what they wanted to understand. Well, is the car park being used specifically for station usage or elsewhere? And the pie chart at the top shows this. So what you saw there is 30% made an onward journey to train, 17% went to Preston Market, and 50% did something else. And so that kind of analysis can be done in more detail, but you can also look at patterns of which are the busiest days, which are the busiest hours. And so those are things that can be done there. And finally, I guess I just wanted to round things out. So that's a kind of quite a quick run through of some of the things you can do with the data, but I just wanted to zoom out again, really, and just consider the data sets more holistically. So Nick spoke about different sets of data, mobile phone data from telcos. He spoke about sensor data, and I spoke in a bit more detail about location-based services data. Essentially, there's a few key things that I wanted you to take away, really, from today, that applies to all data sets, really. And the first one is that some of the difficulties that we encounter with using any data is the lack of robust ground truth data. Now, on the one hand, if we had lots of robust ground truth data, perhaps we wouldn't be looking for other data sets in the first place. But the issue is that it makes it very difficult to tell what good quality data is and isn't. And that leads me to my next point, which is that I think the thinking has to be insight-led and not data-led. So it's not about what can LBS data tell us, what can telco data tell us. It's looking more specifically at the questions that we're trying to answer, and then looking at specific data sets, their strengths and weaknesses, and how those can be used to answer the question. Because what happens otherwise is that data sets get labeled as good or bad. And really, the key message from me is that it's use case dependent. A question as simple as what is the sample size can be difficult to answer, because is it as in the first slide I showed, is it the 3 million monthly active users when it comes to LBS? Is it for the telcos, is it their market share of the telecommunications market? Or is it the percentage of actual movements that are seen? And if it's movements, for example, then that relies on stronger ground truth data. So that's something to be aware of. And finally, I think we just need increased transparency all around, and we're trying to bring that to the fore a bit more. But essentially, the thing I think that everyone should be doing is asking difficult questions of data providers and people who analyze the data, so consultants like ourselves as well, pushing for transparent reporting of sample rates, of reporting on bias, of ground truthing, and to be clear where we don't know the answer to some of these questions, because it's only by understanding the limitations that you can use the data. The limitations shouldn't be seen as a way of shooting down particular data sets. It should be seen as a way of understanding where and when they're useful. So that's everything from us, and I hope that was useful and that you found at least a few key takeaways that you learned something from or took away some thoughts from. But thank you for listening, and we're keen to I'll hand back over to Gav to look at questions and things. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Ali and Nick, for your very insightful presentations. Now, we have had a few questions come through, and we're running a little bit short on time, but some of the earlier questions that came through were heavily focused on privacy and restrictions and needing to anonymise data, which clearly would make it challenging to plan an ideal world just for me based on my patterns of behaviour. And also suitability of some of the sample sizes that you touched on towards the end there as well, Ali. Just on a topical part of the conversation, can we, sorry about my puppy dog.
Perils of working from home.
Nick, can you, Nick, can you just explore just the impacts of COVID? We touched on the dashboard that we've got briefly, but also just how local governments might adjust for planning.
I saw the question come through about how does local government plan for the future. A lot of it comes down to what period you're planning for. So, like we've been having discussions with Professor Graham Curry at Monash. And he's been doing a lot of research and getting a lot of surveys out looking at potential long-term impacts of COVID. And so obviously we only need to look outside to see the short-term impacts. A lot more people are working from home. There's a wide range of impacts as far as the transport system at the moment. But the long-term impacts, there's a lot of unknowns. Are they, will we start to see more of a work from home behavioural aspects to our work going forward? I think the jury's out on that. Will we start to see staggered hours of employees? I think the jury's out as well. Certainly out of what Graham was finding, Professor Curry, was that it was everyone's desire to get back to normal, was to get back to pre-COVID behaviours. And so I think I'm still unsure about whether we should even expect much change in the long run. And long run, I'm talking post-vaccine. So whenever that may be, if it may be. But if we do find a vaccine, I suspect we'll get back to normal. And so therefore, in coming back to the planning question, it makes it a little bit tricky. It depends on the time frame you're planning for. If you're planning for the short term, then data sets like this can help you see how we're coming out through the recovery phase of this. Data sets like the LBS data, sensors as well, and all the data sets we've spoken about today. But in the long run, I think we need to keep up household surveys that state governments do to ensure that we do get that longitudinal behavioural aspect, so we can understand, are more people starting to work from home? We've got a census next year that could be heavily impacted by COVID. So yeah, it comes down to the time frame by which you're planning for. I'd say in the long run, I'd still be planning on pre-COVID, would be my take.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So just a couple of late questions that have just come in. Ali, if you wouldn't mind just turning your mind to those. And I think really understanding how the data sets we've explored today, how do they work in the ecosystem of data, and how do we go about analysing those for projects and to answer questions?
I guess there's two things. So what we've seen is that there's a lot of data that is kind of turned into products, and so we've seen with telco data, there's a lot of kind of things like OD, origin, destination, move, and so on that's been kind of more productized. And the advantage of that is that it means that it's easier to access the data. You kind of know the formats that you're getting, and it's easy from that perspective. However, one of the downfalls of that is that you tailor less to specific project requirements. And so I guess what I'd say is that the model for using the data is kind of manifold. There's either looking at some of these kind of standardized products or doing more bespoke analysis, and that's what we're trying to do more of to address specific questions. And the reason that's very relevant is because depending on whether you want to understand the travel behavior of a particular cohort, for example, for those kinds of use cases, you would need to use only the data for which you had very persistent movement data across time, and that reduces your sample size a great deal. Whereas if you're interested in high-level visitation to different areas, then you can you can avoid filtering a lot of the data, and you can use a lot more of it. So what I'd say is it really depends on the specific requirements of the project as to which you choose. But there's a role for different data sets in different use cases. And it's worth saying sensor data as well. Like I think where you're focused on monitoring volumes on an ongoing basis, and you really want to dig down into specific locations, that's where that kind of data comes in handy. So it's a tough one to answer in a kind of one sentence, as you will have got from my rambling response.
Excellent. No, thanks, Ali, and thanks, Nick. Well, in a short period of time, we've managed to cover a lot of ground and hone in on things that we think will be useful as you navigate the world of big data and planning. If you would like to know more about us, you can track us down on LinkedIn or go to veachlister.com.au. Also, feel free to send Ali, Nick, or myself a note if you have any follow-up questions. Once again, thank you for your time. We sincerely hope that you learned something valuable or interesting about the world of big data and how it can be useful to you in your world of planning. A recording of this webinar will be made available shortly. Thank you and enjoy your big data journey.